Sorry about that, everybody. I just had a little camera issue. But here's just the last few minutes to wrap up this chapter. So, we're looking at this unemployment graph and seeing what was wrong with it. We had these values, and we saw what the actual percentage of the actual unemployment rate. And we saw that it was an attempt to make this look level, like not that much was happening. But in actuality, these numbers, we should have actually seen this downward progression. So this one, again, this is actually a little bit worse, but it happens. This goes a little bit beyond just misleading. This really, really has a large intent to deceive you with this. But still, everything we see needs to be accurate. All the idea about being proportional, well, that idea of proportional, the size of the bars, the size of the characters that you use in the picture or anything like that, like we saw earlier, the size of the barrels, all those kinds of things. All those are an attempt to deceive because they're showing something that's not true, making something look bigger that's not. Well, here, same thing, but through numbers. But also by having this chart, the scale on the side, though, that should have been better. So like I said, this went a little above and beyond, but still has some aspect, again, of error, certainly, but also some intent to deceive. So that's kind of the last big one. Again, earlier, saw a little bit with characters, but I should make one more example to be clear with that. Just drawing a little picture. That doesn't always add something, but we see that's very, very common. So this was a similar representation, and this was discussing oil production, where actually specifically talking about how much oil was brought into the United States from different areas. And they had this little chart to go with it. So it wasn't really oil production, oil, supply, so to speak. So how many barrels, and I really have no idea how much it was, but how many millions of barrels? 1, 2. And then they had these little pictures, and on the side they drew something like this. And they had, I think, a few other places as well. But basically, the point was that they were trying to draw an oil drum, right? They were representing oil production and how many millions of barrels or drums of oil, and they were showing a drum. But what they were showing was like this was a very skinny drum, whereas this was like this big wide drum. But in actuality, the only thing that mattered was still the height of the drum. So in actuality, both of these were relatively the same amount, but once again, they were trying to draw your eye to this, trying to draw it away from the actual information, and through the use of a little bit of a graphic, you just look at this and see a bigger, fatter oil drum, and therefore you automatically think, well, this is where more of our oil comes from. So again, just trying to make sure all these little things that we're mentioning, all these different examples, again, not just a mistake. There's always a purpose behind it as well. You're doing this not because of an accident. You're doing this with the intent to try and push one side of the story, so to speak. So just finishing up in the book, they have numbers 4 and 5. Number 4, they talk about being careful to interpret patterns in scatter plots. You know, we already mentioned how we'll talk more about scatter plots a little further down the road, but basically just trying not to exaggerate what it actually means. And we've always said that, how a lot of people, we start to see statistics and then we make these grand conclusions, and there's always this little bit of, well, based off of this information. We always have to be very clear with that caveat. But when we get to the scatter plots, we'll start to see some of those positive and negative correlations, those trends. And one of the first things people do, they see that and they immediately jump and make that connection. And then they take it further. They start to draw a causation relationship between the two variables. So again, we have to be careful. We'll get there and talk a lot more about what is correct and what you can say. But we want to start noticing the patterns. But again, we always have to be careful. Based on this data, this is what we see from here, but also keeping an open mind. What else might we want to know? What other information would help to make this decision? Why are we only seeing the last year's worth of data? Why don't we see the last 5 years? Why are we only looking at this one state or this one class's production? Why not look at the entire school? As you know, we always can do more and see more over a longer period of time, or to try and get more information over a larger sample. So, number 5, here's the biggest one. Make sure your graphical display creates the right first impression. Everything we've said, it's not about fancy, it's about conveying the right information. So being clear, using a good title, to make it clear what this display is about, having your axes labeled well, having a scale, having your units, something like this. This represents 2 million barrels of oil. So I could just write the number 2 instead of the number 2 million, but I have to have the units to make that clear. Having dates, I abbreviated here, but in any formal graph, we want to have all that very clear. And we've always discussed, always having some other information. Where did this come from? Who was sampled? Where do we get this information? We always do that to keep that clear. So, all this information, a lot of different examples of misuses. This is a section where the book gives you a few more problems to go through to see some of the improperness, to start to get used to see some of these things. And this is another good place to think about writing, everybody. To think about, if I ask you to give an example of a misuse of statistics, to have one that you could really go to be able to show a graph and go through all of it. Not just show a graph and say something's wrong, but to show a graph, to be able to discuss what is incorrect about it, what is wrong, what should be corrected, and to also explain where's that intent to deceive. Again, there are people who make mistakes with graphs, but we also want to be clear that this can be used to deceive.